Chapter 24, Lylan 12.20, May 24th, 2311 AD. Lylan could make out some light, and knew that it was morning when she finally arrived at the overgrown ruins of the Project Angelmaker field site. The people of the 21st century had mounted a massive, however pointless, military response to Daniel's threat, mobilizing every available resource in the effort to contain him, which all proved fruitless, most of them being immediately disarmed and dismantled before ever taking aim. It seemed hopeless, but then a scientist, Dr. Ivan Geleva, in the year 2078, hatched a brilliant plan. He was aging and had gone blind, and having learned of Daniel's inability to intrude upon the blind as well as he could everyone else, he enlisted the blind together and began construction of a facility under military oversight that would house a weapon they intended to develop, which would be capable of inverting and annihilating Daniel Dwyer, or any spirit for that matter. A smaller, much less powerful version of the device he intended to build had been developed in a laboratory and utilized to make physical contact with a sample of Daniel's form. In the beginning, Daniel would volunteer for testing, as both he and the science community struggled to understand his nature and composition. Daniel originally shared in the enthusiasm when mankind learned how it was that he interacted with the world, when they'd identified the frequency at which he existed, information lost to his children. For it revealed to him something of the nature of his own existence, something that to him had been all but a mystery. But his punishment was swift and his fury unrelenting when he finally learned of the plot that had been hatched against him. This was one of his first acts of clear global tyranny, an event not recorded in any history book that any one of his children would ever read. When he discovered that Dr. Geleva had gathered the blind with the intention of destroying him, not only did he brutally murder those involved in the project, exposing the doctor outright before publicly executing him, but in order to prevent this chink in his armor from ever again being exploited, he executed every last blind human being on Earth, man, woman, and child. The blind, he'd learned, represented a possible threat to him, and he had no reservations whatsoever about eliminating that threat. So within a matter of a few days after his discovery of Project Angelmaker, there was not a blind person left on Earth, all of them having been mercilessly eliminated once he'd located them, for doing nothing more than being who they were. It would prove to be but the first instance of global genocide that he had in store for mankind, the second coming in the form of the complete cessation of some bloodlines, those of the weak and infirm, the sick and disabled. No genetic disorder would carry on into his future generations of children, nor would any disfigurement or disability, or even what he mysteriously called the inferior and redundant genes that have riddled mankind for so long. His children would be perfect. When Emma Carter was born and he discovered her blindness, his first thought was to kill her. But he went against his intuition and decided to spare her and care for her instead. For at the time of the birth of Emma Carter, it had been over 200 years since he'd had to commit an act of murder, and he'd fully settled into his role as the benevolent shepherd of the earth. The notion of killing one of his own children simply because she was born blind had passed swiftly from his mind. Thus, when intuition ignored is not opportunity missed, it is danger invited. For intuition is purposeful. Feelings are the pathway to communication with nature and with the universe itself. If he'd have only trusted his intuition, he'd not be in the situation he was in today. He was right to fear that newborn baby at the time, and if he'd known then what he did now, he'd have ended her life the moment she was born. If he would have had any reason to suspect that she would at any point in her life threaten him in any way, he would have killed her the day she was born without a moment's hesitation. But he had quickly rationalized his fear, deciding instead to keep her as his own, and now he was paying the price for having done so. True to his nature, Daniel had exquisitely tortured and expertly mauled those involved in Project Angelmaker until he'd squeezed every last bit of information about the project from every single one of them. Many of them were so far removed from the project that they themselves were ignorant as to its true intentions. He tortured and killed them anyway. Those at the heart of the project had been trained to their cores with regards to what to say in the situation, and all of their stories corroborated flawlessly, Not one of them broke. Then, satisfied he knew all there was to know and that he'd sufficiently dismantled the threat, Daniel killed them all. There were only 2 people on Earth who knew about the failed endeavor and the nuances of its details, Daniel and Llewellyn. Only Llewellyn knew more than Daniel. For Dr. Jelliva was a genius of incomparable status, and he had fully deceived the demon. The machine that Daniel had destroyed was a decoy, cleverly containing all of the major parts that he'd requisitioned for use on the project so that he would find all of the pieces that he expected to find. Only the majority of those parts were missing components that had been secretly put to use to build the actual Angel Maker at a site 2 miles from the decoy site. The machine was nearly complete, and all of the necessary parts were present and ready to be assembled. The valiant crew had been days, if not less, from completion when he discovered their plot, and so for all that time it had just been sitting there, waiting for Llewellyn to come along and finish it. As she passed the wreckage of the faux facility by, much of it indistinguishable from the surrounding nature that had slowly encroached upon it over the centuries, she shook her head. This version of the demon was an idiot, she thought, so easily deceived. Perhaps it was because Daniel Dwyer was the only version of the demon that she'd ever conceived of that ever came close to loving or trusting anyone that it was blind to so much. In any other form, any one of which would have been completely heartless, the demon would not have been so careless. She took a lanyard bearing a swipe badge from one of the many long-dead corpses that littered the grounds, and she held tight to the old triggering mechanism that she'd taken from the vault on the military base as she quietly continued on to her destination, her destined place, the place where she would die for the very last time. She would be there within the hour. Llewellyn 1.1, May 7th, 9644 BC. In the time of the first coming of Llewellyn, she was revered as a god. Llewellyn had become queen, having never heard the name Hemat before. On her own, she had shaped the world to place herself on top, and her people were prosperous as a result. She was Sapretta, the warrior queen of Atlantis. She was 32 years old, and having adapted so well to the power she'd been gifted when she'd turned of age, could already see more than 5 days into the future. This, and her ability to see through the eyes of the many people of the world, made her and her empire formidable. They were a warring, seafaring people with a radical advantage over their enemies across the sea to the east. They had Sapretta to not only guide their military maneuvers, but also to spy on enemies from a distance, enabling them to forever outmaneuver them, her soldiers made aware of their enemies' every intention well in advance of their every meeting. Even a small force under her direct guidance was capable of massive destruction, but battles can be long, often much longer than her window into the future, and on some rare occasions she would unwittingly march her armies headlong into their graves. Her overconfidence made folly when met by insurmountable odds. This famously happened during the attempted siege of the Mediterranean in the 97th century BC, when her forces were overrun by the local response and driven back. Sapretta did not know how precarious a place her beloved home held on the planet, but the entire landmass on which it was built was doomed, as it sat directly on the point of convergence of 3 tectonic plates. The continent that comprised the breadth of her rule was the crown of a swell in land that was susceptible to motion in one of several directions, along both the vertical and horizontal axis, susceptible to sinking, rising, and being torn asunder. The capital city, with its concentric rings of land, would in the end be sunken along with the rest of the surroundings, but even if it had not been intentionally drowned as it was, it would not have been long before it would have been dredged to the ocean floor due to tectonic plate movement, and regardless, its features over time would be all but wiped away by the dramatic collapse and resulting geologic activity as the whole of the landmass meets the same fate, churned at the ocean floor in the time following the destruction of Atlantis. All that the world needed was a nudge in the wrong direction. The ice from the Great Freeze was already melting. Omens were abundant that the end times were nigh. It wouldn't take a lot to make this nightmare world come about, to drown civilization, veritably ending the world. All it took in reality was a well-placed meteor strike. For the time, Atlantis was paradise, warmed by the Gulf Stream while the majority of the world to the north was still buried under slowly melting ice, remnants of the glacial epoch that marked the age of man known as the Ice Age. Sea level was considerably low due to how much of the world's water was encapsulated in glaciers on land, and the coastal civilizations of the time were all in peril. Earth was on the precipice of a cataclysmic worldwide flood. Water ice is less dense than liquid water, which is the reason that ice floats instead of sinking in liquid water. So where the interplay between sea levels and water runoff from melting ice has the greatest impact is not from the melting of glaciers afloat in the Arctic or elsewhere, but from the melting of ice trapped above land. The ice that floats in the ocean is essentially water in one state displacing water in another state. Once melted, the collective volume is not radically changed, and sea levels remain relatively unaffected, possibly experiencing a slight decrease, a slight drop in sea levels as a consequence. However, when the ice trapped over land melts and returns to the water table in the oceans, it increases the overall volume. It adds water, and when this happens rapidly, the sea levels rise rapidly in concert. It was not only the kingdom of Atlantis that would drown in the forthcoming cataclysm. The whole of the world was about to be decimated. History was about to start over, old worlds to be lost forever. Roughly 90% of the Earth's population lived in coastal cities at the time. The toll of the devastation would be unparalleled by any other event in human history and would drive the species to near extinction once more. History would be forced to begin anew after the Great Flood. Queen Supreta, the first incarnation of Lyalan, was a fearsome warrior. She was most often recorded as heading up her armies like she herself were the head of an arrow, and in many cases as being the first to draw blood, all while inexplicably remaining untouchable herself. In battle, not only would she ruthlessly pursue her goals, plowing through fields of soldiers, very frequently turning her enemies' weapons against their own brethren, redirecting the momentum of their attempts at her, an army all her own, but she would also jealously defend her soldiers when they were threatened. Her personal entourage of loyal warrior guards was known collectively as the Ever-Dying, because if Supreta foresaw any danger to them in the flux of the bloodshed of war, she would intervene mid-battle with intense ferocity, pouncing on soldiers often twice her size if not bigger, mercilessly eviscerating them or worse to prevent injury to her guard. The Ever-Dying were absolutely faithful to Supreta and worshipped her in as much a sense as any could. They protected her, and she protected them. To them and so many others in Atlantis, she was a true god, and as word of this spread, it became rumored around the world that the Atlanteans walked shoulder to shoulder with living gods. Of all who would be Lyalan, she was the most adept at using her powers. She trusted in her visions and would often let her intuition guide her in a way that no future vessel of Lyalan ever would. She was often asked why they were doing something or why they were going somewhere by her military commanders, and her most frequent response was, "Because it is what I have foreseen." Supreta knew that the world was large, larger than she could traverse in the forthcoming 5 days that she was privy to, and that it was only by traveling that she could project major change to the fringes of the diameter to which her area of immediate effect was restricted. She had to be able to see what would happen if she went to the exotic foreign lands that she saw through the eyes of their populations, and could not do so if she were any further than 5 days' travel away. Often, they would be redirected en route to a selected destination because of the divination of a less than favorable outcome, and take their fire elsewhere, leaving their intended quarry unchallenged for the time. It did not matter to Queen Supreta. There were always other worlds to conquer, more resources out there for the taking. It was her dream to one day mount a successful offensive against the fortifications of the Fertile Crescent civilizations. She'd tried twice, set sail intent on bringing the thriving chain of societies to its knees, but had in both instances ended up redirecting her armies, foreseeing too many losses to consider it a victory, the many lands united against her in arms, despite her eventual projected success. She was not willing to trade the lives of so many of her people for mere material gain. even though she didn't bat an eye when her soldiers slaughtered the innocent people of other nations. Often, while at sea, Supreta would be seen sitting with her eyes closed, deep in contemplation, previewing her many choices, the many futures that which she could bring about if she so desired, guiding the direction of her fleet of boats while attuned more to her intuition than to any kind of reasoning or thought. This was what led her to the giant. As she allowed her mind to drift amid the many possible futures, letting the nearly endless variations wash over her in search of some great find, some true wealth, she found him. Being that Supreta was the first Lyalan, the Atlantean queen would serve as the basis for all future versions of Lyalan to come, but she would only go by the name Supreta for another few days. Hemhut would reveal her true name to her, and she would from then on become known as Lyalan, taking it as her name, and Queen Lyalan would have a king with great power. As the day drew nearer and nearer, Supreta watched her possible future interactions with the giant, all the different ways that they could carry on, and did so wary of one thing. She could not see through the giant's eyes, could not see its distinct future, and could only see it through the eyes of the ever-dying and herself. The creature seemed benevolent, and her every foreseeable interaction with it favorable, but she feared the giant in a way that she feared nothing beside, for she was unaccustomed to surrendering control or having her predictions potentially challenged, and here was a being beyond control, one that could easily interfere with her acts of conquest, an unpredictable potential threat. Yet she trusted her visions, and so she went in search of him. The Supreta of tomorrow, this Lyalan as she called herself, loved and trusted the giant, so she was ready to love and trust him too, guided by her vision. Thus she followed her intuition, followed her heart to her destiny. If her vision of the future was to be trusted, then this giant would free her mind of the constraints that bound it, giving her the ability to see farther into the future than she'd ever dreamed, in turn revealing to her that she would live again and again, 12 times altogether. If the words of her future self were to be believed, the future was to be paradise, blissful serenity groomed by the brotherhood of man as they unite under the banner of Lyalan and her giant. Where Supreta had been content to conquer and pillage, it seemed Lyalan was intent on saving the world, using her abilities to help all of mankind, not just the Atlanteans she'd for so long made her one and only priority, and if her words held true, they would succeed. Supreta was already starting to feel a change inside of her, and for the first time was beginning to consider, as Lyalan did, the value of human life, and to regret having so long been the epicenter of so much violence and death. When they made landfall, she gathered her commanders and briefed them on the situation. They were unwavering in their loyalty and would follow her every order no matter how seemingly impossible, taking on faith that they would succeed, their fates, their very lives entrusted completely to their divine queen. When, in their native Atlantean tongue, she told them that they were on their way to meet a magical creature, few were even skeptical of her. When she told them that their efforts were going to become more humanitarian in the future and that they'd better start becoming accustomed to calling her by her new name, they responded as she expected. One of them said, "My sword is yours, my queen, be it sheathed, melted down, or bathed in blood." Another said, "Queen Supreta is no more. All hail Queen Lyalan!" In the distance, Hemhut, in his marine entombment, heard her name, the name of his forgotten love, but he did not know that he was real, much less that he could move, so he only listened as they drew nearer. He had been alone, adrift in the nothingness of his nearly vacant mind for ages untold, every moment a lifetime, only remotely aware of his own existence, but his solitude was coming to an end. She was coming for him. She would be there soon, and Hemhut would at long last be alone no longer. Daniel Dwyer, 22, July 1st, 2055 AD. Dr. Foster's day in court had finally come, and he was nervous. Up until the moment that he was outside the courtroom doors, he was confident that his defense was sound, but coming face to face with the reality of his situation, actually standing in front of the oversized doors behind which his fate would be decided, he suddenly began to second-guess himself. He and his attorney had a leg to stand on, but it was not so solid a structure as to inspire any great confidence in its ability to stand. His head was buzzing, and he tried to calm himself, breathing deeply, actively trying to quiet and clear his mind. The court looked none too pleased to see him as he was paraded down the aisle, but his attorney, Henry Summers, gave him a reassuring nod as they took their seats and quietly said, "We got this." The crowd outside of the courtroom had to be controlled, not only kept from harming the doctor on his approach, but to keep them from attacking each other, as some had come who supported the doctor in the spirit, and others had come who condemned them both. There was more yelling amid the crowd than there was from it, and many fights broke out. It was a relief when the din of the crowd was finally stifled by the closing of the heavy doors. The doctor was ready for a lengthy trial, one in which his daily life over the last several decades was going to be candidly picked apart. Much to the surprise of everyone there, the trial would never happen. He was going to be walking back out of those doors a free man within minutes. The prosecutor gave his opening statement, confidently declaring that the doctor willingly and knowingly aided in the vigilante tactics of the spirit, both by housing him and by failing to report his knowledge that the corporeal form of the vigilante was in fact Daniel Dwyer, and that it was he who, in spirit form, murdered the late president. He stated that if the doctor, a public servant, had done his civic duty and turned the criminal he was housing over to the authorities, then not only would the president have been spared his life, but also the countless others that the spirit is believed to have killed would still be alive. The justice did not seem very amused and called on the defense to respond. Dr. Foster's attorney took the floor and proposed their defense strategy. He told the court that the doctor had been attempting to prove whether or not Daniel Dwyer was a spirit for decades, and had yet to discover conclusive evidence in support of positive identification. He said that the burden of proof was on the prosecution to demonstrate to the court that Daniel Dwyer was the spirit. The recent escape of Daniel and the footage of the spirit carrying him out of the hospital led by Hannah Dunn did not bode well for this line of defense, but it was still one of the best strategies they had. When he was done talking, the justice scoffed, visibly disgusted by what he'd heard. "I have heard enough," the justice said, turning only briefly to the other justices, feeling no need to confer with them. "I was expecting that you were going to shed light on how this hoax was perpetrated, how the world had been tricked into thinking that the spirit killed the late president, why it was done, and who executed it. Instead, you come in here trying to sell the court on a ghost story. This is not the Dark Ages, gentlemen. We do not prosecute people for their involvement in the supernatural. If I were to allow this to continue, this demonstration would only serve to strengthen the superstitions of an already confused and misdirected public. Obviously, some advanced type of technology is being used to try and fool the people. It is the position of the court that there are no such things as ghosts, period, end of story. The president was not killed by a ghost. Dr. Foster, you are free to go. Case dismissed." He banged the gavel, and that was that. Then he went home and prayed that night to the Holy Ghost, asking for the truth to be revealed, never taking into consideration what a hypocrite he actually was. Meanwhile, reports of sightings of the spirit were on the rise from all over the northeastern United States and along most of the Atlantic coastline. The death toll was massive, with at least an average of 10 to 20 reported daily incidents of fatal vigilante justice naming the spirit as the culprit. Headlines of every paper every day, local and national, had the name Mr. 8 splashed all over it, and it seemed that the public was convinced that Daniel Dwyer was the spirit after all. For it was his picture that accompanied the headlines, and though not one report described a red hand, most of the time when the spirit was pictured, his ball and right forearm were portrayed as red. The highest court in the land had exonerated him from guilt by altogether declaring that the spirit did not exist. But the media was not done feeding the flames, and the public was not ready to pull their arms from the fire. However, he was still considered an escaped fugitive, and there was still an active manhunt for him, but they would never find him. Hannah had hidden him away well. He was hers and hers alone now. There were only two people left in her world, her and her Savior, her love, but she vied for there to be a third. She was desperate to become pregnant and forced Daniel to give up his seed to her several times every day. She was 76 years old and had been experiencing symptoms of menopause for some time, but she did still have the occasional period, and hoped beyond reason that she would miraculously have his child. She didn't know it yet, but she had succeeded. She was pregnant, but unfortunately the child would never see the light of day. Daniel would kill her before she would give birth to the miracle child. As it had been foretold more than 50 years prior at her 16th birthday party by a piece of plastic, Hannah will die. It is certain. The doctor returned to his home to find the windows had been boarded up. He surveyed the damage that had been done as he walked from room to room. The heat was sweltering and the house smelled terrible. He got his car out of his garage and went to stay in a hotel where he contacted repairmen to fix the damage to his house and activated all of the utilities. Within a few weeks, the house was made livable again, and he started piecing together his life, unaware how little time he had left. Lyland 1.2, May 10th, 9644 BC. She had bid her troops, 50 strong, to remain behind and make camp on the shore, and took a party of 6 of her ever-dying with her. After a 2-day journey over the lands of the old world, she found him. They came to the banks of a river, and Queen Lyland pointed to the exact place where Hemhut was buried under the silt and told her men that he was there. They instinctively drew their weapons, and she quickly told them to lower their arms and sheathe their blades. "The giant is kind. He is no threat to us, and if he was, our weapons would not help us, as they are useless against him," she said in their lost Atlantean language. "I would dare to say that he is all-powerful. Not one of us can kill him, not even me. He is impervious to the sword, to fire and water. His entire body is a shield. There is no version of the future where any leaves so much as a mark on him, not one where he is moved an inch by any of us or anything besides. Put your weapons away. There will be no need for them. He wants to be friends. He is a friend. He does not speak Atlantean, but once he awakens my mind, I will be able to speak his language, a language from the distant future, one I see myself speaking, but do not yet understand. I will only comprehend once my full vision of the future is revealed. Then I will be able to communicate with him. Trust in me." They did as she asked, put away their meager weapons, and stayed on the shore as she waded waist-deep into the water and called to her giant. In her mind, they had been friends already for 5 days, the 5 coming days, and she was anxious for him to open her mind as was foreseen, and to know all that which her future self had professed to know. "Hemhut," she said, "it is Lyland. Come to me." She spoke in her dead language, but Hemhut knew that she was talking to him. She was looking directly at where he was buried, and had said his name and hers. Hemhut was his name. When it registered that he had a name, it gave him identity, and he tried to move. He was surprised to find that he was where he was, and that his will to move resulted in movement, but at the same time not surprised at all, like he had always known on some level that he was at the bottom of a river, and yet had simply stayed still and quiet for so long that it had become meaningless to be anywhere, and as a result he considered himself to be nowhere. For he remembered seeing the lands above the river, then having the water in his eyes, then the dirt, then nothing. He slowly walked toward Lyland, and she spread her arms wide and reached out to him as he emerged from the water in front of her. Her ever-dying gasped, some of them involuntarily taking a step back as his massive form arose from the river. She attempted to speak to him in her language, but he did not understand. From her hand gestures, it seemed that she wanted him to place his hands on her, to touch the sides of her head with his fingertips. Hemhut looked at her nervous ever-dying, then back to her and lifted his hands, reaching out toward her. She smiled and stepped toward him, again tapping the sides of her own head. Then she took hold of his hands and guided them to where he touched his fingertips to her temples, and there was an inaudible electrical zap as her vision of the future began to furl open like a carpet being unrolled. She took the moment in, and for the first time saw how pivotal Hemhut would be in her lives, how everything that she'd heard her future self say was true. Her vast cognition of the coming ages changed her just as she'd foreseen it would, and the path to world peace and prosperity became apparent to her immediately, like it was the natural course of the coming events of man's history. There was a change in her eyes, in her voice, in her very being. She had become Lylin. She looked up at her beloved giant, the one so devoted to her from now and for all of time to come, her future king, and she said in the language of the giant, "Hello, Hemhut." Relieved that she finally said another word that he recognized, his knowledge of English having remained intact, ingrained in the base of his memory, he said, "Hello, Lylin." The ever-dying began to mutter amongst themselves upon hearing his deep, gravelly voice, even more so when their queen continued talking to him in a language none of them had ever heard before, but that their queen seemed to speak fluently all of a sudden, a language known to the stone-skinned giant. For in her revelation of the future, the language of her love became more familiar to her than any other, as she would spend so many thousands of years speaking mostly to Hemhut. Knowledge of their future love ignited the flame of it within her heart, and she was his and he hers from that moment on. She fell in love with him because it was what she was meant to do, and he was already in love with her, having seemed to have been made for no other purpose. "Oh, you have shown me such splendors as the world would never suspect, Hemhut." She motioned for him to carry her, and he gently picked her up, and she proceeded to climb to her perch on his shoulder, taking her traveling throne for the very first time. Where there was once only war, conquest, and survival, there is now peace, prosperity, and plenty. You and I together will lead the people of the world to enlightenment and brotherhood. Lives need no longer be lost to natural disasters and other localized cataclysms, as all manner of nature's wrath can be circumvented, preempted by the knowledge of the distant future now at my disposal. I see so much, my love. I see everything." "How?" the giant asked, her guard again shaken by his voice. She pointed and said, "That way, my love." He began to walk in the direction she'd pointed, maneuvering his body to keep her from being struck by the branches of trees as she rode upon his shoulder. Then, in Atlantean, she beckoned her guard to follow. "With me, my ever-dying, the future begins now."